Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Keesa Schreane, and welcome to the Refinitiv Perspectives live stream. The World Health Organization reports that anxiety disorders are the most common of mental ailments worldwide, with major depression disorders and social phobias being the most common anxiety disorders, affecting about 1 in 13 people. Now, that's roughly 7% of the world's population. And so a lot of us are dealing with this as we work, juggling caregiving while working, adjusting to less daily mobility while working, experiencing longer work days where the boundary between home life and office life is virtually invisible. This is now life for many of us. And with so many changes in our outside world, how are we tending to our mental health on the inside? May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and today, Toby Amis of Refinitiv will share his experience dealing with anxiety. And also joining us is Stacy Thomson, founder of the Performance Club, to discuss tools and strategies to help us manage both old and new pressures. Thank you both, Toby and Stacy, for joining.
Oh, welcome. It's a pleasure. Really looking forward to the conversation.
Great. And Toby, let's start with you. When did you start recognizing patterns that we term as anxiety patterns in your behavior, and what were those specific patterns?
Well, thanks, Keesa. It's great to have the opportunity to join yourself and Stacey today, particularly in this really important week, and to try and shine a light and bust some myths around anxiety. I think, first off, anxiety in itself is a really interesting term, and I think generally has negative sentiment attached to it, and often for good reason. I've learned to accept that on many levels, when channeled positively, my excitable nature and energy and passion has really enabled me to be successful at work. But then caring, or perhaps even over caring, I think is how I would describe it, is driven from within myself most usually. So in terms of busting myths, my guess is that it's more usual for people to worry about things that not. It's the extent to which we manage that worry that makes the difference. But I think we all have mental health and we all need to look after it. And I think that's one of the key messages for today. To answer more directly, I didn't start recognizing the patterns. What actually happened was a really good friend of mine around 5 or 6 years ago described me as an anxious person. And it was done in such a matter-of-fact way that I almost fell off my chair. I'd never considered myself to be anxious. I mean, excitable, clearly, maybe, but not anxious. So it really struck me, and it caused me to enter a period of sort of deep reflection. It's one of those kind of blink, you look up and you're 40 moments, but in this case, it was kind of blink, look up and you're anxious moment. Because what I discovered about myself were typically anxious behaviors. I was overthinking, over caring, getting things out of perspective, seeking gratification, feeling overwhelmed generally, and also physical symptoms such as, knot in my stomach and really feeling, both physically and mentally anxious. So that was the key part for me. And I think now what I realize is that I just, at that time, until that point of reflection and which led to acceptance, that I just wasn't really armed with any particular techniques to either recognize or deal with it. So I just kind of lived really up until that pivotal moment with anxiety. And I still live with anxiety, but now I have a means to channel it correctly, shall we say.
Great. And Stacy, let's bring you in here. Interested in hearing about what steps people should take. So Toby, what steps did you take when you first saw signs and saw patterns and heard from your friend about these patterns? And Stacy, what steps do you see people taking?
I think what's interesting and what Toby's describing actually is how we can, our own narrative and the lens that we view some of this stuff can really make a difference to the outcome. So for example, Toby talks about how initially he thought it was around excitement, because actually the same physiological changes in the body occur, whether you're excited or you're fearful. It all depends on the narrative and the lens that you're interpreting it through, which makes a difference. And then I guess the more you feel that you're one or the other, the more attention you then pay. You look for the evidence to confirm that that potentially is true. And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But our brain system is usually complex. And I think when I describe it as having an Apple Mac on steroids in your head, and you have no idea how to use it. And yet we're taught maths, English, geography, etc. at school. Yet the fundamental thing which will help us prosper and get the most success out of ourselves is our brain, and yet we don't understand it. So I think understanding and self-awareness is where it needs to start, which I think, from Toby's experience, learning more about why it does things and what's behind it has been really helpful towards your kind of, I guess, using it to your advantage, right, Toby?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it was, I don't see it as a weakness as such. I see it as something I accept, and I've now learned techniques that I'm now able to catch myself when I'm going into one of those sort of, my thoughts are sort of going off into a negative path. I can catch it, and I know now there are certain things that I bring into my life to help me deal with it, such as very, very simple things, such as routine. I did some cognitive-based therapy as well, which, when I was going through the process, seemed very almost obvious, but it was calling out the obvious, and it was really trying to change those mental pathways that you form from a very early age. I think that that need to be changed. I think it's probably worth, I'd like to sort of shine a little bit of a light on my career path and how I find myself working at Refinitiv, because I think, for many people, there is anxiety about, especially younger people, about, what career choices they make and knowing what they want to do and so on and so forth. Well, I can tell you now that I never knew what I wanted to do. I never aimed to work in financial services. It was I thought I'd work out along the way. I'm quite a pragmatic person. I tend to have a glass half full attitude, and I thought that I would, find the right sweet spot as I went along. I went to Goldsmiths University in New Cross, which Stacy and I have since discovered we both went to. So that was an interesting one. And I was the first in my family to go to university. I grew up in rural Norfolk. And now, in retrospect, and I did a lot of thinking retrospectively about, my younger life and my career leading up to it, to see, where there were instances of dealing with anxiety. But in retrospect, I think perhaps it was already a little bit set in stone, in that I was kind of the golden boy of the household. I got a scholarship to go to a public school. I was very good at competitive sport. So even looking back then, I think there were signs that, those mental pathways of perfectionism and wanting to please were already in place. I gained a 2-1 in history at Goldsmiths, but during that time, I discovered a real passion for clubbing and buying vinyl and DJing and promoting parties. And I thought that was probably the career path that was most likely for me. And by 2006, we were putting on some big parties, some really big names along, Garnier, too many DJs, Felix the Housecat, people like that. But one of the things I reflected on was that from the very first party to 50 people to the very last party to around 2,000, between 10 in the evening and 12 in the evening, I would be found hiding behind a set of decks, absolutely terrified the place wouldn't fill up. Even in the last event, 6 years after doing them, they were always full, but I would always be found until the crowd came into the room. I was DJing, and then I found that energy level, to Stacey's point, went from anxiety. The energy level didn't disappear, but it just transferred like a seesaw and started being channeled positively, until in the end you have a room full of people, and at the end of the night you leave with this incredibly warm glow that you've really helped people release, and you've watched it all unfold. So yeah, that was kind of my early career. Stacey, did you want to jump
And we can
in?
get addicted to that, right? I think what's very common, and I specialize in perfectionism, and I think some of the reasons it comes is because you're rewarded when you do well and you're punished when you don't do so well. So, when you think about your story, there's a huge amount of pressure on you from a very early age, but also, you didn't fail too much, Toby, did you? You kind of were achieving and getting that validation constantly. So as we grow up, if we don't develop some kind of coping mechanisms and kind of, I guess, strategies for managing some of that stuff, then we kind of sail through life. And perfectionism, it's it's easy to ignore it if it's providing you success all of the time, because again, a lot of people go, well, there's nothing wrong with being perfect because actually it's brought me this, that, and the other. And I always laugh when you talk to CEOs and senior executives who say, oh, I don't have a mental health story. And I go, there's absolutely no way you got to the top of the tree without one, because it's driven by something. You know, it's hard work to get to be a CEO. It's hard work to have a top leadership job, you know, and unless you have those drivers to achieve. And I guess for you, that was that validation and that people pleasing. You know, I guess very early on, Toby, what you're describing is you got addicted to people being excited by what you did. And I guess that made you feel good. So it kind of stimulated your pleasure receptor. And I guess what happens is the more that pleasure receptor is stimulated, the body wants to return to homeostasis because it recognizes, whoa, this is a bit too much dopamine.
That's amazing. That's great information. Yeah. And Stacy, I just want to jump in on that. And Toby, I love the fact that you transitioned your career into where you are now, data financial services, from DJing. And I'm going to get you in touch with D Nice, because I think you have a career on the Instagram area. So maybe get a live DJ battle against D Nice there. Stay tuned. We're going to circle back on that. But one thing I really want to talk about too, Stacy, we talked about mental health and dealing with that in the workplace. And taking the flip side of that, in many cases, some of us work in environments where we experience extreme microaggressions, right, on a regular basis. There might be lack of inclusion that we're dealing with. There might be inequitable treatment. Clearly, just an overall toxic work environment cannot be good for a person's mental health. I think we can all agree on that. So, Stacy, what is the impact of that, of ongoing harassment, ongoing microaggressions, lack of inclusion? What is the impact of a toxic work environment on someone's mental health and on their work performance? Let's talk about that.
I mean, I guess that comes back to your threat response and what you've been taught when you're growing up. A lot of us are taught that we have weaknesses and that we're different to certain people. And then that sets our own internal version of who we are and our identity. And kind of we start to look for evidence for that it exists in the world. And then, you know, we enter these workplaces and they're full of people who want to do well. They're full of people who are, I mean, now we're so competitive with each other. It's very difficult to actually care about where each other are coming from. So I think we're very busy in our minds. And I guess when you're an outsider or you're more sensitive to these types of things, first of all, it can start making you ruminate and think a little bit about what's going on, because you want to confirm your own inner critic as well, because you already have these weaknesses, you already have these views about yourself. And then the more people compound these things, I guess it provides more evidence. And then you start creating your own identity.
Well,
and then
let me just, with that point, I think a lot of people would say, I don't know if I have an inner critic. I think I just work in a toxic work environment. So there is a difference if you are susceptible, if you do have the inner critic, versus you have a pretty good, stable sense of self, but you work with people or in an environment that is considered toxic in some way, whether it's inclusion issues or whether the microaggressions. I think those are two different scenarios. So can you speak to both?
Yeah, I guess also Toby mentioned this when he was in his kind of talks that we've had about the fact that one of his roles, he actually got made redundant, and it forced you, didn't it, to kind of like, you wouldn't have done it yourself, but now that you were in that situation, you were kind of grateful afterwards. But I think with the pressure that we feel, we often feel that we have to do things which we don't actually want to do, but we don't want to be seen as a failure. We don't want to be seen as that affecting us or our reputation. So we tend to stay in toxic environments. I think what we have to understand, in order to change a toxic environment, we have to make a change. And if that environment's not conducive to us, then we need to be moving on, because it's very difficult. Because unfortunately, in recruitment, we will tend to recruit similar people to us. That's innate in us. It's built in. We recognize similarities, and we tend to choose similarities over things that we don't like. And then you end up with a cluster of these people. And I think it's very hard for that one person to come into the workplace, and because you feel like they're all bullying you, and you are kind of like a victim in the whole concept. But unless we start changing the narrative and pretty much all saying that kind of behavior is just not acceptable, and we all won't accept it, and then we can start changing culture. And I think that's where the root causes start from.
I can jump in just with a little bit of detail around that, because I think that's really important. I found myself sort of jumping from a retail bank into a temporary job, and I had 6 months of experience of that, and then I went to an investment bank in the back office, and very quickly found myself as a as a sort of trainee foreign exchange trader on a trading desk. And the next 3 years were particularly anxious. I soon realized that I didn't like the job. An extremely toxic environment. I mean, 25, 30 years ago, FX trading desks were a very different place to they are today in terms of toxicity.
Yeah.
I didn't feel confident enough in myself to make the decision to walk away. I knew it was toxic. I was 26. I was on one of the biggest FX trading desks in the world. It was ticking a lot of the boxes of my inner self. And there is this thin line between anxiety and excitement. And as Stacy said, I was made redundant in 1998 as all the currency pairs disappeared with the euro. But in my mind, it was, it felt like such a complete failure, even though I realized that many currency pairs were disappearing. And I remember, standing outside the office at the Thames Exchange, crying for about 5 minutes, and then had this kind of realization of what someone's just made this decision for you, the decision that you were brave enough to make for yourself. And as I walked down the road over Cannon Street Bridge, I can remember the weight lifting from my shoulders. And it was this incredible feeling of release, of being set free in some ways from someone making that decision for me. So I think that was certainly a pretty powerful lesson for me.
Yeah. And let's talk about the impact that not making that decision earlier are for those people who choose to stay in environments. What impact does that have on someone's mental health? Does it indeed have an impact? Is that backed up by fact?
Stacy?
God, I mean, toxic environments, you don't want to be going to work, do you? It's awful. And you tend to start censoring yourself. And also, like I say, we all have inner critics. We all have those things that drive us. And the thing is, when we're in these toxic environments, we start then looking for the evidence that confirm that, because we end up being ostracized. I mean, that's quite a tribal thing that happens. And when you're ostracized, you then tend to turn inward and start blaming yourself for that situation. On the other hand, you could then start externalizing it and then getting into rows and conflict, and again that will affect your productivity, right? So because you're heavily concentrating on that threat. This is a threat. Toxic environments are not very nice to be in, and they're not exactly places where you go and you enjoy. And it might be that again it turns the love of the job away from you, but what I will say is that, and touching on Toby's point that, he didn't actually find out what he wanted to do and he actually fell into it. I think our younger generations now, they very much feel that they have to know what they're going to be doing at a very young age. They have to have that certainty. They're fortune telling about how their life's going to pan out. And, it's very difficult when you end up with what you wished for and suddenly what you wished for isn't what you wanted, and it creates unhappiness. And then you're constantly searching and feeling disappointed. And I think that can then have a detrimental effect on your low mood and your anxiety over your decision-making process, and also whether you leave, will you be seen as a failure against your peers, etc., and within society, will your parents be disappointed? All of those things start ruminating in your mind, and I guess then you're moving into more unhelpful thinking and catastrophizing, etc.
Wow. And I can clearly remember, obviously being delighted to find myself in that situation and waking up excited. But over the course of the 3 years, towards the end of it, as I, woke up and walked over London Bridge to go to work, I could feel the knot of tension and fear in my stomach. I hated it, but I just wasn't. I guess I wasn't old enough or mature enough. I didn't understand myself enough or brave enough to have walked away from it myself. So actually being made redundant from that job was probably the best thing that ever happened to me.
Well, so much to unpack there. And, we're going to be opening up to questions from our live stream audience shortly. So if you have questions, go ahead and send those over to us. But meantime, let's talk about some of the positive behaviors that we've seen during the epidemic. So in other words, for example, I'm hearing stories from loads of people saying, you know what, Keesa, since the pandemic started, people have just been a lot nicer. Colleagues have just been friendlier. They've asked me how I'm doing and they really mean it. So is there a way for us to keep those types of behaviors going even post-pandemic, post the new normal? How do we keep that compassion that seems to have really appeared and resonates with so many people? How do we keep that going?
Yeah, I mean, interesting enough, I think this pandemic has done more for mental health than years and years and years of campaigning. And I think what's happening is we're seeing a change of culture within the workplace, with employers, I guess, recognizing that the welfare of their staff is really, really important. And I guess leadership qualities of empathy and compassion and honesty, etc., used to be seen as a luxury item, and now, no, they're absolutely part of the job description. So I think when you start changing behaviors in the workplace, and we talked about this the other day, I think a small habit takes about 30 days, a little bit bigger habit takes about 3 months, and something bigger takes 6 months. So actually, the longer we are immersed in this new world, this new norm, and the more we are, I guess, stepping out of our own comfort zones and practicing some of these skills, if we don't have them, then the easier they will get and the more they will become routine. And I think society would have us, and the newspapers and the media would have us believe that there's a lot of bad stuff to come out of this. But actually, I see lots of wonderful things to come out of it. And it is all about the narrative and the lens you view the world. And I actually think we will have a really great opportunity in the future to be more innovative, more creative, more kind to each other, less materialistic, less success driven, but equally as productivity. Our productivity will be even greater. So there'll still be the same amount of success, if not more. I think we have a really great opportunity, actually, above all anything else.
I think that's.
Do you see tips or strategies? Oh, go ahead, Toby.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's really interesting, that the idea of, and it's not a new one, of looking at life through a certain tint of spectacle, and in many ways that's exactly it. It's just really about, catching that excitement, moving to anxiety, and taking a step back and trying to unpack it and to put it in perspective. Often it's a case of just getting things out of perspective. And for me, I often ask myself, can I change it? And if I can't change it, I shouldn't be getting worried and anxious about it. If I can change it, I should take some positive action and try and do something about it. But if I can't, I just need to accept that I can't. And that's, I think it's looking at life through a different coloured lens is one way of trying to do that, I think. Putting things in perspective.
And let's get into some questions here. So are there top 3 perspectives or tips that you would have for leaders who are really looking to continue to have this compassionate, kind work environment, even post-COVID? Top 3 tips or top 4 tips that you would have for leaders who really want to do that? What would those tips be?
Okay, Toby, I can.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is it's very much a desirable skill, and it's very much expected now more than ever for leaders to consider the well-being and happiness of their staff. I mean, they always have, great leaders always have, but I think more than ever, it's paramount right now. And certainly in Refinitiv, I think we've done a great job of really trying to make sure and be genuine about I'm a leader of a small team of people, and I genuinely care about them. I genuinely want them to be happy. I worry about those in the team who are completely isolated and working crazy hours, right up to those in the team who are like myself, who have 2 small children and are relatively pulling their hair out about trying to get the right amount of work done. I mean, I distinctly remember the first 3 weeks of lockdown were really anxious times for me until I established a routine. And now I look after the children from 8 until 12, and I don't worry about not getting any work done at that time. And then I swap my wife, who looks after them in the afternoon, and suddenly I'm back to being able to feel less overwhelmed by things. So I think compassion and an understanding, and also I think this virtualness and the webcams and the letting people into your homes and the letting people into your lives, and it's okay for kids to run and it's okay for dogs to bark. I think these are all things we should look to really take forward. There's the silver linings. I feel like I know people within the team now, certainly the team in Bangkok, far better than I ever did before the lockdown. We're chatting with them, they've got their webcams on, and I feel much more engaged. As a very visual person, I love to see people's faces and their facial expressions, and those kinds of things I think really sort of shine for me.
And Toby, that's a great response to, and actually a great lead into another question that we received. Do you have recommendations on coping for people now working from home with families, and how to cope with stress in this new environment when we're working from home with our families? Stacy, what do you have to say about that?
Do you know what? I think there's an acceptance that this is a bumpy ride. And also on the back of what Toby said about teams, what managers can do is that they can get to know who's in their team and what potentially could be the risks or problems. Never before we've had to be flexible. If you've got 2 kids at home, of course you're going to be struggling to do your job, and you're going to be working late at night trying to get that work done. I think now more than ever, that knowledge of who's in your team and what their circumstances are, understand, acknowledge it, try and help, keep in contact with people, and if need be, refer to your EAP program. I mean, we're talking a lot about protecting the NHS per se over here in England, with the fact that we're protecting from an illness, but in the future we need to protect people from mental health. And if you are struggling at the moment, you have an EAP program that people are sitting there waiting to take your call. And I think that's the key thing, is getting in early. You don't have to be really unwell to access or learn about how to manage yourself a little bit better.
Okay, great. Our next question here. Someone commented, excellent discussion topic. Thank you. In today's climate where more and more people work remotely, how do you pick up mental health signals of your employees who may be going through difficult scenarios? So connecting is one way of helping, but keen to understand what more we can do all day.
That's a really good question. So certainly regular check-ins, being cognizant of the situation, whether someone's on the one end of the spectrum where they're in isolation, and I'm quite regularly trying to tell at least one person in my team to not work the crazy hours they're working, right through to really understanding where people have children, that I think you just have to accept that there's good days and there's bad days. I think one of the things that we've started doing, as well as those regular check-ins, where I don't know if you've found the same thing, but every call now always starts at the first. It was 10 minutes on the situation. Now it's probably only 5 minutes on the situation. As we go through time and accept it more, maybe it'll just be a quick check-in. But we have started doing things such as social calls, having tea together, doing charades, doing calls which are absolutely not to talk about work. They are absolutely to talk about, work is the one banned topic. This is about you. It's about your family, and also experimenting with different things. But I think if you're really conscious that people may be struggling within your teams, and with good reason to, it helps you to pick up on the signs. And I think using cams can really help as well. Personally, I find it much, much easier as a visual person to pick up on someone's mental well-being or lack of when I can see the person and talk to them face to face. So I think, regular check-ins, make sure check-ins aren't always about work, but some are absolutely about the social side of things, for me, are the kind of tactics that I'm using.
Great. Yeah. So the next question here, working from home is meaning longer hours, and one might say that people are more stretched than ever. What can companies do to ensure the good health of their employees? Can Stacy talk more about EAP?
So EAP programs, an employer sister provider that a lot of companies have, and you should be able to access that on your web page. And I'm assuming your internal website will have that number. And there's counsellors. You can get an assessment, and CBT. So cognitive behavioural therapy is a particular clinical intervention that Toby was talking about, but it's one of many. And CBT looks at how we can change the way we think or feel, or our physical sensations or our behaviours in order to get a better outcome. And sometimes people need guided through that. And I guess from a perspective, our employer, we have to remember that our employer is not a clinician. They're not a superhero either. They're just trying to navigate the whole kind of playing field just the same as you are. And like I said earlier, this is a bumpy ride, and we all have to be able to be open and flexible. I think flexibility is key when it comes to how we kind of, I guess, as a leader or even as colleagues, about how we're going about this. So I guess EAP programs are really useful, and they're available to everyone. Our employees pay for them, and I think only about 5% of people take them up. So they're very much underutilized. But they're great, not just for people who are unwell. They're to help you figure your mind out and things that are going wrong or errors in your thinking, which can be really helpful.
And Refinitiv does have an excellent employee assistance program, and I can stick my hand up and say that with experience.
Yeah.
So it sounds like flexibility, understanding, and kindness. Those are three words that I heard a lot throughout this discussion, and a great way to end it. Toby and Stacy, thank you for joining us for such an important topic.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Yeah.
And thank you to everyone in the live stream today for participating. If you've enjoyed today's live stream, we recommend an on-demand webinar on emotional well-being in the time of COVID. You can register for it by typing the address shown on your screen or scanning the QR code shown on your screen right now. Thank you so much for joining. This is Keesa Schreane. Have a fantastic day and be well.